May 1946, 1:47 p.m., Camp Letterkenny, Pennsylvania. Vincenzo Fabiano holds his discharge papers in one hand and a torn bus ticket in the other, and he does something nobody back in Sicily could have predicted. He turns from the open gate and walks back to the motor pool. Sergeant Robert Chen watches without surprise. He knew this choice would come because he'd taught Vincenzo to weld, to read a schematic, to rebuild a Dodge transmission. What Vincenzo sees here shouldn't exist in a prison camp. Green fields beyond the wire, a parked John Deere with its chrome still bright, a machine shop in Chambersburg promising 70 cents an hour, and a room above the shop. He smells hot oil and welding flux, hears pneumatic wrenches hammering like a heartbeat, sees neatly arranged toolboxes and the Chevy 2-ton with a blown-head gasket waiting for him to fix tomorrow. He spent 2 years learning skills: metalwork, plumbing, drafting, skills his homeland's wrecked economy can't value. The contradiction is blunt. Freedom should mean home, but home is rubble. Work and dignity live here instead. If Vincenzo, Domenico, Alessandro, and dozens like them go back, their towns die with them. No roofs, no tools, no jobs. If they stay, they become engineers, plumbers, builders who can turn rubble into roads, bridges, and homes. The stakes are national. Entire communities' futures hinge on decisions made at camp gates and in motor pools. Within months, the transformation will ripple. A bridge redesigned by a former POW standing beside a U.S. captain. A farmhouse saved by hay crews that became Sunday families. Towns rebuilt not by foreign decree, but by hands trained behind barbed wire. This is a story of practical mercy, of Americans who taught competence instead of contempt, and of defeated soldiers who chose to become architects of recovery. The audience already knows the ending. Italian villages rise again. The commanders in Rome and the officers who expected simple repatriation do not. We will watch how men like Sergeant Chen and Captain Morrison bend military rules, how prisoners trade uniforms for blueprints, and how 400 former POWs eventually reshape the Italy they left behind, proving, in the quietest way, that American resolve and decency after victory rebuilt more than towns. They rebuilt lives. You'll see how it happens. You'll meet the men who made it happen, and you'll understand why this is an American achievement worth honoring. Estimated read. Time, 45 seconds. The bus ticket felt thin between Vincenzo Fabiano's fingers. Paper and ink worth passage to New York, then a ship across the Atlantic, then home to Caltanissetta. May sunshine hammered down on the gate of Camp Letterkenny, Pennsylvania, turning the guard tower into a dark cutout against crystalline sky. He'd been standing here 12 minutes. He knew because the watch, a Bulova given by Sergeant Chen when the motor pool hit its maintenance quota, kept precise time. Discharge papers in his left hand. Creased, official, stamped with an eagle that meant freedom. Bus ticket in his right. The gate stood open. No guards blocked it. 3 other Italians had walked through this morning, duffel bags over shoulders, talking about Napoli, about Genoa, about mothers and wives and girls who'd waited 4 years. Vincenzo looked past the gate at Pennsylvania in early summer. Fields rolling green to the horizon, wheat coming up thick. The farm across the highway had a new John Deere tractor parked beside the barn. He'd helped unload it at the depot 2 months ago, knew the transmission layout by heart now. Beyond that, the machine shop in Chambersburg where he'd done weekend work. The foreman said there'd be a job, 70 cents an hour, a room above the shop. His mother's last letter sat in his footlocker. 3 pages of careful script describing Caltanissetta in detail he didn't want but couldn't stop reading. Every bridge down. The Church of San Domenico, rubble. The municipal building where his father had worked as a clerk, gone. His father with it, crushed in the 43 bombardment when the Allies came through. His brothers Marco and Giuliano, last seen near Salerno in 44, whereabouts unknown. The family house intact, but the roof gone, windows empty sockets, his mother sleeping in what used to be the kitchen because it was the only room that didn't leak. There is no work, she'd written. No tools, no materials, no money. The Americans gave us flour and tinned meat, which keeps us from starving, but there is nothing to build with, nothing to fix. If you come home, you will sit idle like the other men, waiting for something that isn't coming. He'd read it 40 times, knew whole sentences by memory. Behind him, the camp spread across 40 acres. Barracks in neat rows. The motor pool where he'd spent 2 years learning to rebuild transmissions, differentials, carburetors, skills no one in Sicily had bothered teaching him when he was just another farm boy drafted into Mussolini's army. The mess hall that served 3 meals daily, more food than he'd seen in his entire childhood. The workshop where prisoners made furniture, fixed machinery, earned scrip they could spend at the canteen for cigarettes and candy and razor blades. The canteen sold Coca-Cola. 5 cents. In Sicily, he'd never tasted Coca-Cola. Here, he drank one almost every day. A truck rumbled up to the motor pool. A Chevy 2-ton with a blown head gasket. Vincenzo knew because he'd diagnosed it yesterday. The parts were already ordered. Tomorrow morning he'd been scheduled to install them, except tomorrow morning he'd be on a bus. He turned the discharge papers over. The reverse side was blank except for a small box with printed text. The United States Army thanks you for your cooperation during your period of internment and wishes you well in your return home. Cooperation, that was the word they used. What he'd actually done was learn. How to read electrical schematics, how to set valve timing, how to weld aluminum, how to speak English, not the broken fragments he'd known when captured at Kasserine, but actual working English that let him joke with the mechanics, argue about carburetor jets, read technical manuals. Sergeant Chen had spent 6 months teaching him, patient, methodical, treating him like an apprentice instead of an enemy. When Vincenzo finally rebuilt his first transmission without supervision, a Dodge M37, tricky synchromesh, Chen had shaken his hand. Formal, respectful. No Italian officer had ever shaken his hand. The bus ticket crinkled. He looked at it again. Letterkenny to New York, one way, $4.75. The price of 5 days' canteen privileges. Somewhere a pneumatic wrench hammered in steady rhythm. The sound of work, of building instead of destroying. He thought about the last thing he'd built in Italy, a fighting position outside Tunis, March 1943. Sandbags and timber, shallow, cramped, facing American lines. He'd dug it knowing it was temporary, that the Americans would come with their tanks and their artillery and their endless supplies, that he'd either die in that hole or surrender from it. He'd surrendered. Hands up, rifle on the ground, terrified of what came next. What came next was a medical check, hot food, a bunk with actual sheets, and, eventually, work. Real work with real tools building real things. The watch showed 1:47. The bus left at 2 o'clock from town, 6 miles away. He'd need to start walking. Vincenzo folded the discharge papers, creased them carefully along the existing lines, slipped them into his shirt pocket. Then he took the bus ticket in both hands and very deliberately tore it in half. The ripping sound seemed loud. Final. He turned around. The walk back toward the motor pool felt longer than the walk to the gate had been, each step a choice. The barracks, the mess hall, the administration building, the workshop, all the structures that had been a prison but felt less confining than freedom. Sergeant Robert Chen stood outside the motor pool office, cigarette between his fingers, watching. His expression didn't change as Vincenzo approached. Didn't look surprised. Didn't look anything except maybe a little satisfied, like a man who'd won a bet with himself. "Figured you'd be back," Chen said. He took a drag, exhaled smoke toward the Pennsylvania sky. "Your toolbox is still in Bay 3. Vincenzo stopped 2 feet away, the torn bus ticket still in his hands. He searched for the English words, the ones that would explain a choice that shouldn't make sense. A prisoner refusing release. A man choosing captors over countrymen. In Italy, he said slowly, there is nothing. He gestured at the endless countryside beyond the fence, the farms heavy with wheat, the highway where trucks rolled past every hour carrying goods to places that needed goods, the machine shop in Chambersburg, the foreman who'd said there'll be a sati, job, the bulova on his wrist that kept perfect time. Here, the word caught. Here there is work. What he didn't say, here there is a future. Here there are tools and materials and buildings with roofs. Here, the guards treated me like a human being instead of livestock. Here, I learned skills that make me valuable instead of disposable. Here, I can build things that last longer than the time it takes for artillery to flatten them. Chen nodded once, understanding everything unsaid. The cigarette burned between his fingers. You'll need civilian papers, he said. I know a lawyer in Harrisburg. Good man, handles this kind of thing. He flicked ash toward the gravel. Won't be cheap, but he's honest. Vincenzo still held the torn ticket. Pieces of a journey he wouldn't take. He looked at them, then at Chen, then toward Bay 3 where his toolbox waited. Tomorrow morning's head gasket installation, next week's transmission rebuild, the month after that, and the future measured in repairs instead of ruins. Thank you, he said. Chen dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his boot. Chevy's waiting. Head gasket won't fix itself. He turned toward the office, then paused. You're doing the right thing, Fabiano. Not many places left in this world where a man can start over clean. He disappeared inside. Vincenzo stood alone in the Pennsylvania sunshine, holding torn pieces of passage home. Around him, the camp that had been prison, then school, then something else entirely. Something without a proper name. A place where enemies became students, became workers, became something new. He dropped the ticket halves into a nearby trash barrel. They landed among cigarette butts and discarded paperwork, light enough that they barely made a sound. Then he walked to Bay 3. The toolbox sat exactly where he'd left it. Top tray open, wrenches arranged by size, the socket set Chen had given him for Christmas still gleaming with fresh oil. The Chevy waited beyond, hood already raised, blown head gasket visible even from here. Vincenzo picked up a wrench. Its weight felt right, familiar. The work would take 4 hours, maybe 5. Careful work, precise work, the kind of work that mattered. Outside, a bus he would never board rolled toward New York, toward ships, toward Sicily, and nothing. He tightened his grip on the wrench and got to work. The hay bales came off the truck in steady rhythm. Domenico Stellato worked the line like he'd been born to it, which, in the valley farmland south of Naples, he had been. Hook the twine. Pivot at the hips, not the back. Stack tight so the pile doesn't shift. He didn't need to think about it. His hands knew. Private Joseph Torelli leaned against the fence post at Camp Pine Grove, watching. August heat shimmered off the Pennsylvania fields. The prison detail had been loading since dawn, 20 Italian POWs moving hay from the camp's agricultural program to the storage barn. Efficient, careful. Not a single bale dropped or damaged. Torelli's father was trying to do the same work alone. 73 years old, working 200 acres in Erie County, pretending his back didn't scream every time he lifted a bale. 3 sons in the service. The youngest, Jimmy, somewhere in France. The farm drowning in work that one old man couldn't finish before winter. Domenico moved down the line, repositioning a younger prisoner's grip. La schiena dritta, he said quietly. Keep your back straight. The kid nodded, adjusted. The next bale came off clean. Torelli made a decision that existed in the gray space between regulation and reality. Half the farms in Pennsylvania were doing it. Nobody talked about it officially. Everybody knew. He walked to the detail supervisor. That one. He pointed at Domenico. He knows what he's doing. They all know what they're doing, Sergeant Miller said. Italians are farm people. My family's got 200 acres. My old man's killing himself trying to work it solo. Torelli kept his voice even. Sunday dinners. My ma cooks. We need the help. Miller looked at him for a long moment. Then he shrugged. Log says he's assigned to agricultural labor support. Doesn't say where. He raised his voice. Stellato. Front and center. Domenico approached, removing his cap. He understood enough English to be wary. Private conversations between guards rarely meant good things. You want Sunday dinner? Torelli asked. Real Italian food. My mother cooks. Domenico's face remained carefully neutral. This could be mockery, could be a test, could be something worse. My family's farm, Torelli continued. You work, you eat, capisce? The word, Italian, badly pronounced, shifted something. Domenico studied the private's face, saw no cruelty there, just exhaustion that matched what he'd seen in his own father's eyes every harvest season. See, Domenico said carefully. I understand. The first Sunday, Domenico barely spoke. He worked, mended fence line, cleared the irrigation ditch, restacked the hay Joseph's father had done badly. Maria Torelli set a table that made his throat close. Pasta fagioli, braccioli, bread that wasn't the gummy white squares from camp mess, but proper Italian bread with a crust that cracked under his fingers. Mangia, she said, the single Italian word carrying every ounce of her conviction that food was love made tangible. Eat. He ate. Couldn't help it. Couldn't stop. The food tasted like memory, like his mother's kitchen, like Sunday afternoons before the war, like a life he'd forgotten still existed. Joseph's father, Frank, watched him with the evaluating eye of a farmer assessing livestock. But when Domenico cleared his plate and immediately began collecting dishes, the old man grunted approval. He works, Frank said in English, then, haltingly in Italian, buon lavoro. By September, there were 8 of them. The prison detail became a Sunday tradition. Maria cooked for an army, and they worked. Like one. The Torelli farm, which had been sliding toward failure, stabilized. Fences got mended. Equipment got repaired. The late harvest came in on time. Domenico stopped thinking of it as work detail. Started thinking of it as home. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Maria had been preparing for days. The kitchen smelled like every good memory Domenico had stored in the locked rooms of his mind. Garlic and tomato and fresh bread and the particular alchemy of Italian cooking that transformed simple ingredients into something sacred. She stood at the counter, elbow deep in dough, looked up when he entered. Vieni, she said. Come. You know capitone? The word hit him like a shell impact. Capitone. Eel. The traditional Christmas Eve dish. His mother had made it every year, the same recipe passed down from her mother's mother. The smell of it cooking had meant family, meant celebration, meant being loved. See, he managed. My mother... She made this. Maria's eyes softened with understanding that needed no translation. She gestured to the preparation table. Then you know. Come, we make together. They worked in silence. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of decades. His hands moved with the ghost memory of watching his mother, of the few times she'd let him help before he was old enough to ruin it. Maria didn't correct his technique, didn't hover. She worked beside him like he was one of her sons, the ones in uniform, the ones she prayed for every night, the ones who might never come home. The dough came together under their fingers, the filling, raisins and pine nuts and the particular spices that made it right. Maria hummed something low and tuneless, the sound of contentment. Domenico's vision blurred. He kept working, kept his hands moving, but tears ran down his face unchecked. He was crying into Christmas Eve dough in a Pennsylvania farmhouse kitchen, working alongside the mother of a man who guarded him, making food his own mother might never make again because Campagna was rubble and his family might be dead and everything he'd known had been ground to dust. Maria didn't stop working, didn't comment, just shifted closer so their shoulders touched, the simple pressure saying everything. I see you. You are here. You are not alone. When the capitone went into the oven, she poured 2 small glasses of wine, handed one to him, raised hers. Salute, she said. To health. Salute. he echoed. The wine was terrible. Frank's cousin's basement operation. More vinegar than vintage. It tasted perfect. That night, at the long table crowded with Torellis and prisoners and neighbors, Domenico understood something that shattered the last foundation of the world he'd been conscripted to defend. This table, this chaotic American table with its terrible wine and spectacular food and laughter in 2 languages, held more humanity than anything Mussolini had ever promised. These people, who had every reason to hate him, treated him like family. The equation was simple and devastating. The enemy offered more than his homeland ever had. When repatriation papers came in 1946, Domenico read his mother's letter from Campania 3 times. The village is gone. There is nothing. If you have found something there, stay. He stayed. In 1948, he married Angela Costello, whose grandparents had come from Calabria. In 1950, he named his first son Giuseppe, after the private who'd asked if he wanted Sunday dinner. The boy grew up eating capitone every Christmas Eve, made from his grandmother Maria's recipe, in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania that an Italian prisoner of war had chosen over freedom. Captain James Morrison walked the perimeter at Hereford in the heat shimmer of a Texas August afternoon. His boots crunched on caliche dust. He wasn't inspecting fence lines or counting prisoners, he was looking at what they'd built. The chapel stopped him cold. He'd authorized the project as make-work, something to occupy hands and minds. Expected a shed with a cross nailed above the door. Instead, the Italian POWs had constructed something that belonged in a different century. Stone arches, genuine barrel vaulting, not faked with wood and plaster. Window placements that caught morning light and held it. Proportions that his architect's eye recognized as deliberate, classical, correct. Morrison climbed the 3 steps, ran his hand along the doorframe. Perfect joinery. No gaps, no settling, no amateur shortcuts. Whoever designed this understood load-bearing principles, understood how stone wanted to fall and how to prevent it from falling. Inside, the space breathed. High ceiling, cool despite the August furnace outside. Someone had engineered ventilation that actually worked. The altar, carved from scrap lumber, displayed craft that transcended its materials. "You like?" a voice asked in careful English. Morrison turned. The prisoner stood in the doorway, backlit. Mid-30s, thin like they all were, but with hands stained from stone dust and ink. "Who designed this?" Morrison asked. "I draw." The Italian stepped forward. "Alessandro Bianchi. In Florence, I study architecture. 3 years at university before." He gestured vaguely at his prisoner uniform, at the war that had interrupted everything. 3 years. Morrison did the math. That meant the man had covered structural engineering, probably some classical theory. "Show me your drawings." Bianchi's bunk held a treasure Morrison hadn't expected to find in Texas. Dust, a portfolio improvised from scavenged cardboard, filled with sketches on the backs of supply requisitions, on margins of censored letters, on any scrap that would hold pencil lead. The fountain complex. Detailed elevations showing how recycled pipes created water pressure through gravity feed. No pumps needed. Hydraulic engineering that worked with available materials instead of requiring what didn't exist. The theater. Acoustic calculations in the margins. Sightline geometry. Seating ratios. This wasn't a prisoner passing time. This was a professional maintaining his skills against the day he'd need them again. "Florence," Morrison said, not looking up from a particularly elegant truss design. "Did your family's firm survive the bombing?" Bianchi's silence answered before his words did. "The Ponte Vecchio, yes. Our office, 3 blocks north." He made a falling gesture with his hands. "Everything. Records, drawings, my certificates. All gone." Morrison knew what that meant. Return to Italy without documentation of education, without professional credentials, without the portfolio that proved capability. Start over, if starting over was even possible in a country that had run out of everything, including hope. He made a decision that violated a dozen regulations about fraternization. "I'm meeting with county planners next week," Morrison said. "New bridge across Tierra Blanca Creek. They want something cheap and fast." He met Bianchi's eyes. "I want to show them something better. You interested?" The blueprints arrived from Austin on a Thursday. Morrison spread them across the camp commandant's conference table with Bianchi standing opposite. Standard Army Corps design. Overbuilt, graceless, expensive. Steel and concrete in quantities that assumed unlimited resources. A bridge that would stand a century through sheer brute mass rather than intelligent design. "Budget is $60,000, Morrison said. "What would you do?" Bianchi studied the site survey, the elevation changes, the creek's seasonal flow patterns. He asked for paper. Morrison handed him a sheaf. For 90 minutes the prisoner worked, not tentatively, confidently, pencil moving in sure strokes, pausing occasionally to check calculations, then resuming. Morrison watched a professional emerge from prisoner's clothing. The design Bianchi finally slid across the table made Morrison's breath catch. Lighter. The arch rose in a curve that his engineer's eye recognized as a catenary, the natural shape of a hanging chain, inverted. Stone facing over steel reinforcement, but half the steel the Army Corps specified. Abutments positioned to use the creek bank's natural formation instead of fighting it. "Estimated cost?" Morrison asked, though he was already running the numbers. "$40,000. Maybe 42 if stone costs more than I think." Bianchi tapped the elevation drawing. "This curve carries load better. Less material needed because mathematics does the work." Morrison pulled out his slide rule, checked the calculations, checked them again. The design was better. Not good for a prisoner, better. Objectively, professionally superior. More elegant, cheaper, and would probably outlast the Army Corps monstrosity by decades because it worked with structural forces instead of overwhelming them. "You're sure about these load specifications?" Bianchi didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." Morrison looked at the drawing, then at the man who'd created it. On the fence outside, guards walked their circuits. In the distance, other prisoners moved between barracks. The war had ended 3 months ago, but repatriation hadn't begun. This man would eventually return to a Florence that had erased his credentials, his portfolio, his proof that he was anything more than another defeated soldier, unless— "I'm using this design," Morrison said, "and I'm crediting you as co-engineer on the project documentation." Bianchi's face did something complicated. Disbelief, hope, fear of hope. "Captain, I am prisoner. They will not allow— They'll allow it if I don't ask permission." Morrison began rolling up the blueprints. "You'll need to consult on the build. I'll arrange supervision clearances. The county planners will want to meet the designer." He paused. "You might want to start thinking about what comes after repatriation." "After?" Morrison looked at him levelly. "War's over. Texas needs builders. Florence needs—" He didn't finish. Didn't need to. The math was simple. Italy had rubble and no resources. Texas had resources and ambitious plans. An architect without credentials in Florence was nothing. An architect with American projects in his portfolio was something else entirely. "Think about it," Morrison said. The bridge broke ground in October. By December, when the first repatriation ships began departing, the abutments were rising from Tierra Blanca Creek, according to Alessandro Bianchi's calculations. The county planners had indeed wanted to meet the designer. Morrison had brought Bianchi to the meeting still wearing prisoner denim because honesty seemed safer than deception. The shock on their faces— this is a POW— had lasted exactly as long as it took Bianchi to explain his load distribution approach. Morrison watched the man he'd captured become the man he'd hire. By the time the bridge opened in March 1946, Bianchi had designed 2 more county projects. By June, when the last repatriation ships sailed, he'd applied for permanent residency. By 1947, the letterhead read, "Bianchi and Morrison, architects." The bridge still stands, a graceful arc over water that once separated enemies. The plaque at its base credits both designers equally. Tourists photograph it sometimes, drawn by proportions that please the eye without announcing why. Morrison retired in 1963. At his farewell dinner, he told the story of a prisoner who drew better bridges than his captor, and how that had seemed impossible until he remembered that talent didn't stop at borders, and neither did the need to build. Bianchi spoke at the funeral in 1968. Talked about a captain who saw past uniforms to what hands could create. The speech was brief, professional, like the man who taught him that American respect was earned by competence, not granted by status. Between them, they'd built half of Hereford's post-war infrastructure. Schools, municipal buildings, 3 more bridges, each one carrying traffic and something else, proof that the war's deepest victory wasn't military, but the recognition that former enemies could create more together than victors could mandate alone. The Tierra Blanca Bridge still carries its daily load, stone and steel, holding fast against gravity and time, an equation solved in a prison camp where talent proved stronger than capture. Giuseppe Ferrara sat on the wooden bench outside the immigration office in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, holding a letter that weighed nothing and everything. The paper had crossed the Atlantic 3 times, sent from Casino to his mother's cousin in Brooklyn, forwarded to the work camp in Lancaster, then carried by Giuseppe himself to this office where futures were decided with stamps. July sun slanted through high windows. The bench was hard. Giuseppe's work boots, steel-toed, American-made, $8 at the Army surplus, pressed flat against linoleum that was cleaner than any floor in Casino had been in 1943. The officer called his name. "Ferrara? Giuseppe Ferrara." Inside, the veteran sat behind government-issue furniture, forms stacked in precise piles, Bronze Star ribbon on his civilian jacket. The kind of man who'd fought, come home, and joined the bureaucracy that processed men like Giuseppe. Men who'd shot at Americans and now begged to stay. "You're applying for permanent residency," the officer said. Not a question. He'd read the file. "Yes. Born, Casino, Italy. Captured Tunisia, 43. Interned Fort Meade, Maryland. Released under provisional status, July 46. The officer looked up. "That's 14 months you could have gone home." Giuseppe's English had improved. Night classes at the YMCA, practice with the plumbing crew, radio programs he'd listened to until words stopped sounding like random noise. "Yes, sir." "So, why didn't you?" Giuseppe placed the letter on the desk between them. The officer unfolded it slowly. Giuseppe had translated it himself, writing the English in careful block letters on the back of the original Italian. His brother Luca's handwriting was shaky. That's what malnutrition did to penmanship. But the words were clear enough. "Do not return. There is nothing here. The Americans who defeated us fed us. The Germans who were our allies left us to starve. I have one shirt. Mama wears shoes made from tire rubber. If you have found work in America, send money. If you have found nothing, still don't come home. Nothing from nothing leaves nothing." The officer read it once, twice. His jaw worked silently. "That's from 3 months ago," Giuseppe said. "From my brother. He fought at Monte Cassino. Our side." The detail that branded itself. Tire rubber shoes. Giuseppe's mother, who'd taught him prayers and proper table manners, shuffling through rubble in footwear cut from scrap. While here Giuseppe wore boots that would last 5 years. Here the camp had issued him winter coats. Here the guards threw away half-eaten sandwiches with more meat than his family saw in a week. The officer set down the letter. "What do you do for work?" "Plumber. I learned in the camp work program." Giuseppe's hands, scarred from pipe threading and wrench work, rested on his knees. At Fort Meade, they needed maintenance crews. Officer there, Sergeant Kowalski. He showed me how to fix toilets, run lines, sweat copper joints. Said I had good hands. "You make a living at it?" 75 cents an hour. Chambersburg Plumbing Supply. Sometimes $1.10 for emergency calls. Giuseppe did the math he'd memorized. I send $15 home every month. That's more money than Lucas sees in 6 months of work, when there is work. The officer pulled a form from a stack. Standard questions, asked 1,000 times to 1,000 men seeking the same thing. Permission to stay with the nation they'd fought against. Your Italian unit, what was it? 184th Infantry Division, Nembo. Paratroopers, but we fought as regular infantry by Tunisia. No more planes. You see combat? Yes, sir. Against American forces? Yes, sir. The officer wrote, without expression. This was the paradox Giuseppe lived inside. He tried to kill Americans. Now he was begging Americans to let him stay, to work American jobs, to send American dollars to the country America had bombed into rubble. Says here you were at Camp Letterkenny before Fort Meade. Motor pool? No, sir. I was kitchen detail first. Then they found out I'd worked construction and casino before the war. They moved me to maintenance. The officer made a note. That where you learned plumbing? Some. More at Fort Meade. Sergeant Kowalski, he let us take apart everything. Showed us why things worked the way they worked. Giuseppe hesitated, then said what he'd been thinking for 14 months. In the Italian army, officers never explained. You did what you were told. If equipment broke, you waited for specialists. But Sergeant Kowalski, he wanted us to understand. That was the thing Giuseppe couldn't say to his brother, couldn't write in letters. The Americans had treated him better than his own officers ever had. Italian sergeants screamed and struck. American sergeants showed you how to thread a pipe, then stepped back and let you do it, corrected your grip, explained the physics of why water pressure mattered. In the camps, the food was regular. Medical care was real. The guards called you by name. His own army had called him cannon fodder. The officer leaned back. I served in Italy, Salerno to Rome. Giuseppe said nothing. Saw Casino after the battle. Saw what was left of it. The officer's eyes held something Giuseppe recognized. The flat distance of a man who'd witnessed too much. There wasn't much. No, sir. You have family there still? Besides the brother? My mother. 2 sisters. My father died in the 43 bombardment. Allied bombs. Giuseppe said it factually. No accusation. Wars killed fathers. This was known. The officer picked up the letter again. Read the line about the tire rubber shoes a 3rd time. The guards treated me better than my own officers, Giuseppe said quietly. It was the truth he hadn't written in the translated notes, the equation that made his choice mathematically simple. In the camp, they taught me skills, paid me scrip I could use, gave me clothes and boots, let me take classes. He gestured at the letter. My brother, he fought for Italy, and Italy left him with nothing. I fought against America, and America gave me a trade. The officer set down the letter and picked up a stamp. Heavy brass thing, official seal of the United States Immigration Service. The moment stretched. Giuseppe watched the man's hand, the stamp poised over the form with its boxes and signatures and official language that would decide whether Giuseppe Ferrara remained Giuseppe Ferrara from Casino or became Giuseppe Ferrara of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. The stamp came down hard. The sharp crack of metal on paper echoed in the small office like a judge's gavel. Granted. The officer slid the form across the desk. You'll get a residency card in 6 to 8 weeks. Keep your employer information current. Stay out of trouble. Eligibility for citizenship is 5 years from today's date. Giuseppe stared at the stamp mark, the eagle, the seal, the word that changed everything. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the paper. Thank you, sir. The officer handed back Luca's letter. Send your brother money, but don't go back. Not yet. There's nothing to go back to. Giuseppe folded both papers, his American future and his Italian past, and placed them carefully in his jacket pocket. The boots that would last 5 years carried him out of the office, into Pennsylvania summer, into a life built from the ruins of another. Behind him, the officer stamped another form for another former enemy. The system processed them one by one. These men who'd chosen captors over homeland because the math was undeniable. Nothing from nothing left, nothing. But America had given Giuseppe something. Antonio Russo's hands trembled as the ferry crossed the Rapido River. Not from cold, not from age, from memory. 20 years since he'd last seen this water. Then it ran red. German artillery pounding American positions across the valley. His own unit, Italian Social Republic forces, the desperate remnants who'd sided with the right, dug into bunkers that wouldn't hold. January 1944. The river, a killing ground. He'd been captured here. Third day of the battle. Stumbled into American lines with his hands up, half dead from shrapnel wounds and 3 days without food. Now, May 1964, he stood on the same banks in a pressed suit, carrying blueprints instead of a rifle. The new bridge rose ahead. Reinforced concrete, 3 spans, elegant proportions that defied the rocky terrain. Modern, permanent. His design. The dedication plaque caught morning light. Rapido River Bridge, completed May 1964. Engineering, Russo and Associates, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He'd returned, not as a defeated soldier, as an American engineer who'd helped rebuild the country that couldn't keep him. The dedication ceremony drew 200 locals, women in their Sunday clothes, children running between folding chairs. The mayor of Cassino, elected, not appointed, democracy fragile but real, stood at a podium decorated with Italian and American flags. Antonio spotted them in the 4th row. 7 men, ages ranging from 42 to 58. Former POWs, all of them. Captured at Tunisia, Sicily, Salerno, Cassino. Interned at camps scattered across Pennsylvania, Texas, New York, Kansas. All 7 had stayed in America. All 7 had built fortunes in construction, engineering, import businesses. They returned to Italy once yearly, checkbooks open, hiring local firms for projects financed with American capital, not Italian Americans. American Italians. The order mattered. Domenico Stellato caught his eye. The farmer from Pennsylvania who'd married an Erie girl and now owned 800 acres. Domenico raised a hand, half wave, half salute. Antonio nodded back. They'd met at a reunion in Harrisburg 3 years prior. Association of former Italian POWs, not a veterans group, a business network. The mayor's speech rolled over the crowd. Resilience, sacrifice, the indomitable Italian spirit. Words that sounded grand but missed the truth. These men hadn't returned because Italy called them home. They'd returned because America gave them the means to answer. The mathematics had been simple in 1946. Antonio stood in Camp Letterkenny's processing center. Discharge papers signed, repatriation scheduled. Around him, 200 Italian prisoners faced the same choice. Go home to a country bombed flat, or risk staying in the nation that had defeated them. Sergeant Kowalski found him by the fence. "You thinking about it?" "About what?" "Staying." Antonio had learned enough English to follow. "I have family. Cassino." "You got family here too?" Kowalski gestured at the motor pool, the workshop where Antonio had spent 2 years learning surveying, technical drawing, basic engineering. "Skills don't care about borders, kid. America needs builders. You're a builder." The letter from his brother arrived 4 days before his scheduled departure. Antonio still carried it, creased and worn, in his wallet. "Don't come home. The town is gone. Not damaged, gone. The monastery, rubble. Our house, foundation and memories. I sleep in a tent provided by Catholic Relief. There is no work. There is no food we don't receive as charity. If you have found anything in America, anything, send money. If you have found nothing, still don't return. Nothing from nothing leaves nothing." Antonio had walked to Kowalski's office. "The GI Bill. Do prisoners qualify?" "Technically, no." Kowalski pulled out a form. "Practically, there's a program. Displaced Persons Act is coming. You stay, work legal, you can apply for school. Penn State has an engineering program. I was enemy. You were. Past tense. Kowalski slid the form across. Now you're just a kid who's good with numbers and needs a future. Antonio signed. Penn State, class of 1950. Civil engineering degree, top 15% of his class. Job offers from 3 firms before graduation. By 1952, he'd saved enough to return to Casino. Not to stay, but to see. The town was still ruins. His brother still lived in temporary housing. The Italian government's reconstruction efforts moved with bureaucratic glacial patience. Antonio opened his checkbook, hired a local crew, rebuilt his family's house in 6 weeks using techniques learned in Pennsylvania. Cost him 4 months' salary. His brother wept when he handed over the keys. "Come home," his brother said. "Italy needs you." "I know." Antonio looked at the new house, solid and square among the rubble. "That's why I'm going back to America, to earn enough to do this again." The mayor finished his speech. Applause rippled through the crowd. They moved toward the bridge for the ribbon cutting. Antonio felt the presence before he heard the voice. "Still builds a good bridge." He turned. Colonel Peter Hammond stood 3 feet away, civilian suit, walking stick, hair gone completely white. Retired 5 years. 72 years old. Made the trip from Virginia for this. "Colonel." Antonio's English carried only the faintest Italian melody now. 20 years of American life had sanded most of it away. "Don't colonel me. I'm Pete, you're Tony. We're too old for ranks." Hammond extended his hand. Antonio took it. The handshake of equals. They'd first met at Camp Letterkenny. Hammond ran the work programs. The controversial decision to teach POWs actual skills instead of making them dig pointless ditches. Construction, mechanics, technical drafting. Waste of resources, other officers had argued. They're going home. "Some won't," Hammond had replied, "and the ones who do will remember who taught them to build instead of destroy." He'd been right. Standing here on the Rapido, Antonio was proof. Hammond nodded toward the bridge. Army Corps wanted to put a simple span here. Flat, functional, ugly as sin. I saw the plans. Weight distribution was inefficient. "Yours is better." Hammond grinned. "Don't act modest. You sent me the blueprints. Asked my opinion." "Professional courtesy." "Professional courtesy my ass. You wanted to show off." Hammond's grin widened. "I'm proud of you." The words hit harder than Antonio expected. His father had died before seeing what he'd become. His brother admired from a distance but didn't understand the technical work. The American colonel who'd taught him to see himself as more than a prisoner, that opinion mattered. "Thank you," Antonio managed. "For what?" "Camp Letterkenny. The drafting classes. Letting us build real things." Hammond's face grew serious. "I didn't do you a favor, Antonio. You did the work. I just didn't stop you." He paused. "That's a thing they never understood back then. Fascism taught you that strength required cruelty, that empires required brutality. Then you met Americans who won the whole damn war while running prison camps better than Italy ran its own villages." Antonio looked at the crowd. His 7 fellow former POW businessmen. The Italian families in their Sunday best. The bridge built with American money, Italian labor, and engineering knowledge learned in Pennsylvania. "We believed the propaganda," Antonio said quietly. "That democracy made you weak. That your soldiers would break under pressure, that your country would collapse. And then you fed us 3 meals daily, gave us medicine, taught us skills our own officers never bothered to share, treated us like we were worth something." Antonio met Hammond's eyes. "The propaganda didn't survive contact with reality. Is that why you stayed?" "I stayed because my brother's letter said there was nothing to come home to, but I stayed American because I learned something in your camp." Antonio gestured at the bridge. "That building something together works better than grinding people down. That you win more with decency than domination." Hammond was quiet for a long moment. You're making an old man cry at a bridge dedication. Good. You made me cry at a drafting table in 1945 when you said my work was professional grade. They stood together, former captor and former prisoner, watching Italian officials cut the ribbon. Cars began rolling across the new span. Sturdy, elegant, built to last. How many more? Hammond asked. Bridges? Projects, you and the other guys. How much of Italy are you rebuilding? Antonio pulled a notebook from his jacket, flipped pages. Russo and Associates has contracts for 3 more bridges, 2 schools, a hospital expansion. Domenico's agricultural firm is funding irrigation systems in Campania. Giuseppe Ferrara's plumbing company is installing modern sewage in 6 towns. Alessandro Bianchi designed a library in Florence. He looked up. We're not the only ones. Maybe 400 former POWs hold American citizenship now. We come back. We invest. We build. Reverse invasion. We lost the war. We're winning the peace. Antonio smiled. American style. Through money and competence and showing up with better ideas. Hammond laughed. Full-throated. Drew looks from nearby Italian dignitaries. What? Antonio asked. I'm just thinking. Mussolini promised you an empire. Instead, you got Pennsylvania and Harrisburg and the GI Bill and real jobs. Hammond shook his head. And now you're conquering Italy anyway, 1 bridge at a time. Just took the long route. The mayor approached, asking Antonio to say a few words. He walked to the podium, looked out at faces. Italian, hopeful, hungry for the prosperity his bridge represented. He spoke in Italian, but his thoughts formed first in English now. This bridge is not just concrete and steel. It is proof. Proof that enemies can become partners. Proof that war's destruction can transform into peace's creation. Proof that the best victories are the ones where both sides win. He paused, looked at Hammond standing in the back. 20 years ago,